Good evening and welcome to this week's edition of Bible Topics. I'm Regan King and I'm joined this evening by Graham Nicholls, who's the director of Affinity, which is a gospel churches in partnership network. There are individuals and organizations, Christian charities attached to that. Look them up. Really great work and ministry that they do. Thank you for joining us, Graham.
It's great to be here.
Now, we're dealing with a very significant and important topic. The topic this evening is spiritual abuse. And the reason that I've asked Graham to join us for this evening's program is the launch of a new initiative, a suite of resources called Challenging Leaders. It's particularly designed for churches, evangelical churches and ministries, based on a statement, an online conversation, and a book which was launched at a recent parliamentary lunch. The lunch was sponsored by a local MP, Janet Debbie, who was the former Shadow Faiths Minister and chair of the all-party parliamentary group for safeguarding in religious settings. Now, I was there at the meeting and I was really happy to hear that this is a topic being dealt with and addressed, recognizing the complication of addressing it. Tell me, Graham, a little bit about Challenging Leaders, the goal behind it, and why churches should get involved.
Yeah, it all started really with a conversation with a guy called Ralph Cunnington. There were a number of abuse kind of scandals happening, which were in the Christian press and some of them spilling over to the national press, where church leaders had clearly abused their position of power, some in ways that were not above a legal threshold, but were certainly spiritually not acceptable. Some actually were above that kind of legal threshold. So there was these situations swirling around. Lots of people had opinions on them. And I was chatting with another pastor and we said, we really need to try and navigate a way through here that is biblically faithful, but is also recognizing the legal situation and the culture in which we live. We felt that some people were veering off into a sort of a whole cultural conversation and things that were just unbiblical. Other people were saying there's not a problem here, there's nothing to see here. It's just being invented by kind of snowflakes and there's nothing going on. And we wanted to say this is a biblical category. We want to talk about it. We want to accept that it does sometimes happen, but we don't want to say that it always happens. So how do we navigate that? How do we work through that? So that was the kind of idea behind it.
Okay, now you've already touched a little bit on how there are two basic views and approaches to spiritual abuse. One is to essentially say, this doesn't happen, non-existent, we should always trust our leaders, essentially. And the other, always, if you say, I'm a pastor or I'm a minister or a lead in a church, you're immediately in the spotlight, under suspicion, viewed as a potential narcissist and spiritual abuser.
Yes.
How can we get the balance right?
Yeah, I think we get the balance right by both having biblical literacy, so we make sure we understand what the Bible has to say about good leadership and bad leadership. And it has lots to say about it. Clearly, it's well known it has lots to say about good leadership in terms of Christ and being the good shepherd, fulfilling all those shepherd motifs in the Old Testament. But it has plenty to say about bad leadership as well. Christ condemning the Pharisees, or in the Old Testament, all the prophets that had failed, or the shepherds of God's people that had failed. So like in Ezekiel 34, where it talks about the terrible shepherds who were feeding themselves and not feeding the flock. So we need to be biblically literate and to understand the good and the bad of leadership. We also need to be biblically literate to say, okay, what happens when people sin in leadership? How is it dealt with? And there is a greater responsibility for those in leadership. So that is true. But also there's fairness and justice in the procedure that we use. And that's both Old Testament and New Testament. It's really clear in the New Testament, if you have an accusation against an elder, you follow those same Old Testament principles. So we need to be biblically literate about the good and the bad and the process. And then we have to be culturally sensitive to say, what are the terms people are using? How are people feeling? What are the sensitivities? And how do we speak into those, but without accepting that whenever there's an imbalance of power, there is always abuse. And, always the accuser is right. The accuser isn't always right, but they also aren't always wrong.
Right.
So it's not easy. It sounds easy, me just describing it like that, but it's not easy. And we have to work at it. That's partly why we've launched a book called Challenging Leaders, coming out next March, which is being printed now. We've got an online conversation going on, and we're starting to do some conferences, mini conferences, like day conferences around the country. First one in Wales in March, where we try and talk through it, have Q&A sessions, and really trying to work through the issue.
And it's about building a healthy church culture.
Yeah, definitely, yeah. And it's about trying to get away from that idea. I mean, I don't know if it's worth reading a bit of Ezekiel, actually.
Please, yeah, take us to that passage you mentioned.
Because I think it's the foundational one, in a way, on which lots of other ideas are based. But it says, "The word of the Lord came to me," this is Ezekiel 34, "prophesy against the shepherds of Israel. Prophesy and say to them, this is what the sovereign Lord says. Woe to you, shepherds of Israel, who only take care of yourselves. Should not shepherds take care of the flock? You eat the curds, the sweet stuff, clothe yourself with wool and slaughter the choice animals, but you do not take care of the flock. You have not strengthened the weak or healed those who are ill or bound up the injured. You have not brought back the strays or searched for the lost. You have ruled them harshly and brutally."
And then the result is the sheep are scattered because, in effect, there is no shepherd.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, of course, the ultimate shepherd is Jesus, who kind of answers the failure of the shepherds in the Old Testament. And he's the one who's going to care for the lost and bring them back and all those things. So, that's ultimately answered in Christ. But it still is kind of the anti-pattern for us to say this is terrible leadership, and this is what happens in churches and groups of God's people when this happens. And we want good leaders who are like Christ, who will not just feed themselves and clothe themselves, and who will not treat the sheep harshly. I don't recognize that the whole idea of imbalance of power is always happening and everyone's a victim. But I do recognize that leaders have particular responsibility, and they do have power of sorts. I mean, it can be overstated, but they have power and influence of sorts, and that's been given them by God and has to be treated very carefully and judiciously, and with not sort of just ignoring it and saying, I can just do what I want and there's nothing to talk about. In
my pastoral interactions with people in Angel, Islington, and elsewhere, I find that there are quite a few people who would, to some degree, identify as followers of Jesus Christ. And when you talk with them, they have an understanding of the gospel. They are striving, from what you can see, to walk in the way of Christ, but they're not attached to any particular church. They're not members in any church, and in some cases they're not even attending any church because of some seemingly legitimate pain or hurt or abuse they've had in the past. Recent census results have said that there's about 46% of the UK that identifies as Christian. But if you look at the statistics of those who actually attend churches, it's less than 10%. And if you look at those, if you whittle it down, well, that's members. Those who actually attend, it's lower than 5%. Do you think that there has been a problem with spiritual abuse that has kept otherwise legitimate, faithful followers of Jesus Christ suspicious of being a part of local churches?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think there are lots of causes for the decline of the church in this country. Some of them are to do with liberalism and a loss of the gospel. Some of them are to do with a lack of practical outworking of our faith in love and good works. There's just seasons that God takes his church through. So all those things are true. And you could say, well, those are the primary factors. But it's also true that the abuses in the church, right up to terrible sexual abuse and stuff that's happened in certain parts of the church, through to just bullying leaders has had an influence, and there are damaged people out there. And you could say superficially, well, they had no right to be damaged. They weren't justified. But in the end, you've got damaged people, and as what the initiative of the book and the initiative of me as a pastor and pastor of pastors really is not just to say there's nothing to see here, or even to say if we follow a just process, we'll conclude that there's not been abuse. It may be there hasn't been abuse, but this person has been damaged. It may be the leader has operated reasonably at one level, but still there's a damaged person, and we need to deal with compassion about damage, and not just go into our kind of bunkers and say, here's one side here is a load of victims, and there's one side here is a load of pastors, and they need protecting. But to deal with people compassionately. So the drifting people in your church and in other churches, in a sort of technical sense, they might not be justified. But in terms of their experience and their feeling, we need to address and try and help them. And we don't want people who are unattached to churches, do we? We want people who are part of the family and are both accountable, but also contribute and get all the benefit of being part of a church. And many are like the Ezekiel passage.
Yeah, in that Ezekiel passage, he says very strong words to the shepherds feeding themselves. Verse 10, thus says the Lord God, behold, I am against the shepherds, and I will require my sheep at their hand and put a stop to their feeding the sheep. No longer shall the shepherds feed themselves. I will rescue my sheep from their mouths, that they may not be food for them.
Yeah.
Thus says the Lord God, behold, I myself will search for my sheep and will seek them out. As a shepherd seeks out his flock when he is among his sheep that have been scattered, so will I seek out my sheep, and I will rescue them from all the places where they have been scattered. So there's a real word of challenge to the shepherds there, a recognition of the abuses that have taken place, but that hopeful promise that the Lord is going to bring his sheep back.
Yes, yeah.
Now, Graham, spiritual abuse, you in this statement, and at that launch at Parliament, it was stated unequivocally, we are making a clear statement, and that clear statement was made, that spiritual abuse exists. So help us with a precise definition of spiritual abuse. Is such a precise definition possible?
I'm not sure that a precise definition is possible, but I think using biblical categories, lording it over people, not caring properly for people, substituting our power or comfort, our exercise of power or comfort over biblical authority, including and excluding people, having factions, cliques, those sort of things, unreasonably giving or withholding of favours, those kind of things, demeaning, verbally or emotionally abusing people in our churches, whether consciously or inadvertently. So those kind of category of things. It's a bit like a number of illnesses where you say, well, there's not a precise test that says go, no go. There's probably a series of behaviours and also patterns of behaviours over a long period of time, where you say, here's a set of symptoms, and if you've got 8 out of these 10 symptoms and they happen a lot, then it's likely that spiritual abuse is happening.
Spiritual abuse, and this is taken from the popular apologetic website Got Questions, can occur when church or cult leaders misuse Scripture to bolster their own authority and keep their members under their thumb. Yeah. For example, a spiritual authority may use Hebrews 13:17, have confidence in your leaders, some translations say obey your leaders, and submit to their authority, to demand blind loyalty and unthinking obedience. Misuse of Romans 13, other passages, God has given me authority over you, thus to disobey me is to disobey God. That's a pretty extreme example, I suppose. But is this common in evangelical churches? Do people elevate themselves to basically be Christ's vicar on earth? You know?
I think sometimes that does happen. Sometimes what sometimes called heavy shepherding occurs, where the leader's wisdom on an issue is considered authoritative. So you may say, I want to marry this girl. And she's a believer, so there's no scriptural reason why not. And I might think, I'm not sure that's a good idea for these reasons. Now, if that person doesn't take my advice, this is not a spiritual problem. I don't have to put them under church discipline or the subtle discipline of perhaps not including them anymore. I've given advice, they haven't taken it. That's fine. And I think it happens in those more subtle ways of that kind of heavy shepherding at times, where our kind of wisdom is considered authoritative. I think in our kinds of churches, I know that's such a meaningless phrase in a way, but in our kinds of churches that are seeking to be biblically faithful, I don't think excessive heavy shepherding happens so much in the sense of very kind of organized leaderships exercising authority over lots of decisions in people's lives. I think it can happen where we're not actively saying my word is more important than the Bible, but we're maybe just subtly saying that by just the way we operate. And we may be, even when we're exercising a correct biblical bit of teaching, so somebody is sinning in some way, and it's biblical. It's not just a wisdom issue. It's a biblical issue. But sometimes we can operate in such a crass and harsh way with people, where we're not going out and finding the sheep who are wounded and seeking to tend their wounds and kind of bring them home. We're kind of out there, and as I think I said on the launch, we're quite prone to shoot the wounded.
Yeah.
So
kick people when they're down.
Yeah. And in the sense of thinking, okay, we need to go into a very strict disciplinary process, and actually these people are a bit of a pain. We need to get them out. They're sinning. It's obvious. They're not repentant. Just get them out. And I'm not saying there shouldn't be biblical processes for church discipline. They should. Sometimes we shy away from that and we create more problems, and it gets even worse down the line. But all these things should operate with compassion and not motivated by what keeps a clean house, what makes my life easier, what embarrasses me or elevates me. And that's the kind of, these are the criteria that I'm using. So I think it does happen, and it has happened in our kinds of churches. And in the book and in some of the presentations we're doing, we're talking about the principle in general, and then we're trying to create some diagnostic tools to say, for example, how do you make decisions as leaders? Leaders have got to lead. You can't just vote on everything and have a committee deciding everything. But how do you make decisions? How do you include people's views in decisions? How do you respond to people who disagree? You've got a new project in the church. How do you respond when someone says, I don't agree with this? Do you say, I don't think we would say quite this extreme, but are you implying you're stupid?
Right.
What a stupid idea, what a stupid view that you disagree with me.
I have heard cases where that has been done or said.
Yeah, I don't think I've ever said that, but I've got to be honest, I probably have, either by body language or by just an immediate response, or even by laughing, maybe sometimes, that happens. And, as I said before, it's about repeated patterns. So hopefully I've repented when I've done that sometimes. But it's how you include, but without saying, okay, we can't make any decisions because one person has a disagreement. But it's how you make people feel heard. And it's a really difficult balance, because people in churches often feel like they're not heard. Sometimes it's because they're not heard. Right. And sometimes it's because what they're saying is not right,
Right.
or is not wise, or is not the majority view. So it's navigating a balance through that. Like a lot of things in the Christian life, it's navigating a balance through that. But if you say there's no problem, you won't think about it. You'll just carry on as you are. So part of the book is not so much it has chapter and verse on how to solve every problem. Part of the book is just saying, if you read this, or if you come to one of the seminars, or if you just look on the website, you'll at least think there could be a problem, and it just makes you more alert. It's made me more alert, even in church meetings since I've started the process. It kind of makes you think, oh, I wonder how that went down. I wonder if I acknowledge that point just for enough seconds.
It's giving people a fair hearing to some degree, enabling them to feel heard and noticed, and even if their view or opinion is not a good idea or not biblical in some cases, to not leave them feeling worthless or unvaluable. I think that's very important. A while back, Graham, I attended a church meeting that I was invited to with my wife, and about halfway through the meeting, I whispered to my wife, I said, I think we've come to a cult meeting.
Right.
And I did some research afterwards, and yes, I have no problem saying that it was a cult.
Right.
While their beliefs in many ways were orthodox and seemed to match on paper a lot of stuff that we would believe as evangelical Christians, they were openly in the meeting coercive in their behavior to people. They were taking new believers and sending them as missionaries to places that they had never been, that they had no calling to, or even in some cases didn't even speak the language, saying we're going to start a new part of one of our international Christian churches there, and then there was someone who, at the advice of the elders, she had been offered this job that was on the other side of the world. It was a life-changing opportunity, but the way she was sharing it was, but now that I've come into this family, the leaders have shown me that I don't need to go there. I need to stay here. And what's more, become a part of this church group that's in this other town that she wasn't living in, and it just seemed very, very coercive and very controlling. And afterwards, I engaged with some of the people, and they believed I needed to be rebaptized because I didn't believe baptism was able to affect my salvation. But the guy said, I can introduce you to someone who can mentor you, and hey, I have hope for you. He took me by the shoulder and he looked me in the eye and he said, there's hope for you, Regan. and I'm thinking, okay, this is not good. Right. This is not a good, healthy environment or situation. It seemed very happy. Yeah. There was a lot of joy that was evident to some degree. But behind the scenes, I did some further research, and there are hundreds of hurt people, maybe even more. I've met some people who had eventually left, recognizing that behind the scenes they had unrealistic expectations, criteria on how many people you needed to evangelize in the week, and how many people you needed to invite to the next service, and just extreme, I would say, spiritually abusive behavior.
And it is culture. It's very like Jehovah's Witness processes, actually, where they're very into the statistics of how many doors and how many conversations, and
very much.
If you go beyond 10 minutes, you get a bonus and so forth.
I think some evangelical churches can flirt with that to some degree. Yeah. Would you say that's fair?
I think it's fair. And I think it's harder to spot. I mean, it sounds like the one you went to. I presume you didn't stay at that church. Very long.
I attended one service, yeah.
But I think it's harder to spot than other things. We're pretty good, not brilliant, but we're pretty good. We're not very good at the aftercare, which is another whole topic for all kinds of abuse. But we're pretty good at if it's immorality or embezzling money with pastors. I think we're reasonable at dealing with that. even in some of the international, known churches, they do at least kind of get to grips with it eventually and deal with it, and don't tolerate it. I think when you've got low levels of the things we've been talking about, or even outbursts of bad temper or something that's a bit more known, and is not difficult to spot, we're not always very good at by either spotting it or dealing with it in the earlier stages. Because I just think it's a cultural thing. I want people in my own church to be able to not start a massive process which says, I want to remove Graham Nicholls from being a pastor of this church because he's so terrible. But I would like them to come around and say, I don't think you spoke very well in that meeting. And to be able to do that informally. And that's a cultural thing. That's not a process thing. That's a cultural thing. And an unhealthy church culture is where that could never happen, where it's binary. Either has to be nothing or it has to be everything. And you have to kind of throw the book at someone and throw them out pretty much. You want lots of stages in between where a believer can speak to me, or two believers can speak to me because they feel it's particularly serious. And for that to be heard and listened to and weighed and all those things.
In 1 Timothy, the saying is trustworthy, and this is chapter 3, verse 1. If anyone aspires to the office of overseer, he desires a noble task.
Yes.
Therefore, an overseer must be above reproach, the husband of one wife, sober-minded, self-controlled, respectable, hospitable, able to teach, not a drunkard, not violent but gentle, not quarrelsome, not a lover of money. He must manage his own household well, with all dignity, keeping his children submissive. For if someone does not know how to manage his own household, how will he care for God's church? And then in 1 Timothy 5, there's the call to make sure you're providing for your family as well. So it's not just about authority in the family, it's about provision for the family. If someone does, he says he must not be a recent convert, or he may become puffed up with conceit and fall into the condemnation of the devil. Moreover, he must be well thought of by outsiders, so that he may not fall into disgrace, into a snare of the devil. And then it goes on and talks a little bit about the deacons as well and their role of service. But that's a clear picture of the type health that we need to look for, and that we as pastors should aspire to emulate in our own pastoral calling. How is it that we can, recognize we have a couple of areas here. First of all, there's the fact that we all are sinners to a degree. We've all sinned. One who says who has no sin is a liar. The scripture saying the truth is not in him. So we are all fallible in that way. I don't think we're defined or identified by our sin anymore as we're in Christ. But how is it that we can hold that in balance with the need to be above reproach?
Yeah, obviously we can't be perfect as leaders, like you say. So it is clearly a matter of degree. You couldn't say, for example, if a pastor ever had a lustful thought, he should be fired.
Right.
But you would say if he had a confessed addiction with pornography or was committing adultery, fired is not the word at all, but you know what I mean? They shouldn't really be in that kind of position.
Exactly.
So I think there are judgments to do with degree of sin, and I think for leaders there is not a higher standard in the sense that is sort of unbiblical, as though we're better people. But I think in our public interactions and in those other characteristics you mentioned, there is a particular standard to aspire to. Not in the sense of legalism, like we have to be that good to keep our job, but we are representing Christ. Where we're under shepherds representing Christ, and we have to work particularly hard at those interactions. And I think it is reasonable to hold leaders to a higher standard, because I think they are held to a higher standard. Otherwise, you could say,
we're held to a higher.
Absolutely. Otherwise, everyone would be a leader, and you could say there is no criteria for being a leader.
Right.
It's just being a Christian is the criteria. And I think what's interesting about that text you read in Timothy and the characteristics in Titus as well, is that they're a lot to do with character and less to do with gifting. they speak into gifting to some degree. Managing your household means you could manage a church. And there's obviously gifts involved in all those character things. But they're a lot to do with character. And what we tend to do with particularly sort of main preaching leaders is we go more for gifting than character. If someone's very gifted, they can explain the Bible well, they're entertaining, they're very winsome in the way they preach. It's hard for us to then think, oh, there are character issues underneath this that we need to deal with, either by not appointing them in the first place or by helping them as they develop and grow in their ministry to develop in their character as much as they develop in their gifting. You know, I have to be honest and say, I've been a pastor quite a long time now, and I think I've developed a lot in my gifting. Whether I've developed at the same rate in my character is another matter. Okay. And you know, that's what I need to work on as much as, maybe more than, you know, the gifting to be able to preach and you know, think of illustrations and you know, sound interesting in some way because God's word is interesting. Yeah. And those things. And that's something that you know, we need to work on and to recognise and to deal with in each other. So, yeah.
One of the things that stands out about some of those cases that you referenced earlier related to spiritual abuse, some of which did cross that legal threshold.
Yeah.
We hear these cases on a routine basis, is the hypocrisy that's involved. If people knew, especially in those ones that went above a legal threshold and found themselves being discussed and dealt with in the public domain, if individuals had seen in a widespread way what was going on, well, they would have been completely discrediting. I think the insidious thing about spiritual abuse is a lot of times leaders portray one thing, they teach one thing, and they expect one thing for others. Behind the scenes, they're very different themselves.
Yeah, that's such a good point. I was going to say earlier, and I'm not going to mention the particular person, but it's one of the high-profile cases turned out to be stuff above a legal threshold, and there was more physical abuse and stuff going on. I was in a preaching group with that person probably 10 or 15 years before that. You know, a little kind of do a little preach and get comment and feedback and so forth. And I remember thinking at the time, because I did my little bit, you know, and I felt quite humiliated by the response from this person leading that. And in a way it was nothing. You know, I'm a big guy and I kind of walked away and didn't think, you know, this was terrible. But interestingly, when a kind of a wider report came out about this person, I completely recognised it and thought, yeah, that was their manner. Now it escalated to other things, and often it can, because once we feel like we can act with impunity, then it tends to, you know, our sinful hearts tend to develop and to do more things with impunity, so it can develop to more immoral things as well. But even if it doesn't, you know, we need to to recognise things at a lower level are still significant. And if I do a bad little 10-minute preach, I do want someone to critique, and I do want someone to feedback. I don't want someone to say, "Oh, that was lovely," when it was actually rubbish.
Yeah.
I missed the main point and didn't, you know, speak from the text.
I'm going to give that next Sunday.
Yeah. Or, you know, I muttered and mumbled, you know, didn't present. So I want that feedback. Yeah. But there are ways of doing it, and that speaks to character. The way we will do that. You know, the way we will praise and the way we will reprimand, probably reprimand's not the best word, but that'll do, is very significant in our character, and how we praise people, because we can praise people to manipulate them. It's not just good that we praise people all the time, because it becomes a tool of manipulation. Oh, you're so wonderful, you're so good at, you know, what you do here, and we're sometimes subconsciously using that as a tool of power, of control. Do you know what I mean by that? Even praising people can be a tool like that. But particularly not praising people, reprimanding, critiquing, confronting people. It has to happen in the church. It's the right thing to do sometimes, but it has to be done with gentleness and with recognising their dignity as people made in God's image, and their dignity as people being remade in the image of Christ, and recognising our own possible failures. If you explain a text to me and I think the interpretation is wrong, I may well be right, and I've probably got enough experience to probably be about right, and I may have done that class 10 times, so I pretty much know the text well. But there still needs to be a degree of humility to not just say, you missed the point entirely, but to say, I'm not sure you got quite to the heart of the text, but what did you think the main point was, and how did that work for you? And to listen and work your way towards what may be in the end a conclusion of, I think you missed the point, but it still gets there in a way where the person feels affirmed and loved and they feel better for it, not worse. They don't feel miserable. And that would be the same even if you want to tell someone they shouldn't preach again. There's ways of doing that as well. So I think, I know it's a bit of a long answer, but the trivial, seemingly trivial, is really important. The small interactions, everything from who you speak to, how you speak to them, in normal informal settings, right through to the public things that happen as well.
Well, that's pretty much how it is in life as well, isn't it? We so often think it's the big things that matter. Really, it's the small things. If you can't get the small things right, how can you be entrusted with the big things? Yeah.
And I think we need to recognize those are important as church leaders ourselves. Churches, as they kind of assess gifting and so on, need to recognize those things as important. And not to go on a witch hunt to say, oh, you behave badly in this context, and just to be constantly critiquing pastors, so they feel totally on edge.
And that does happen.
I'm afraid to say anything now.
Yeah, that does happen, and that can be abusive as well.
Yeah. I mean, it's worth saying, although we've kind of majored on pastors a bit, spiritual abuse can happen in all directions. It can happen from a member who becomes disgruntled and aggressive against a leader, and just has vexatious accusations. So it can happen that way. It can also happen with powerful factions within a church. So you may get a younger people's group, an older people's group, a members who've been there a long time group, or you get a significant family. I've got a number of family members in my own church, and I'm constantly thinking, people joke with me about it, and thankfully it's a joke at the moment, but I'm constantly thinking, we've got 3 or 4 families who are related to me in the church. It's a church of about 100, 170, so it's diluted, but it's still significant. 3 or 4 families. And you're constantly thinking, we want to make sure we're never seen as a block with a power base, and never seen that you've got to get past Graham and this other set of family members in order for a decision to happen, or a decision's never going to happen, because we basically decide everything. And we joke about it, but we also think it's serious as well. That you could do that. So spiritual abuse it's not always the pastor. It can sometimes be significant families. I think that happens more in smaller churches where they get a young pastor in perhaps, and the pastor suddenly realizes, oh man, there's all these power dynamics going on. And there's a guy who's not even an elder perhaps, but who has really significant sway, because perhaps they financially are significant contributors, historically, they've been there a long time, and that things are done in certain ways. And where you discover where power lies is where you try and change something. And you discover, as a pastor, I can't change it because this family doesn't want me to change it, and they hold sway. So just to say, it happens in all directions. It's not just about the pastor as well.
We've done a program on domestic abuse, and some of what you were saying there has reminded me that actually a lot of the same abusive behaviors can be transferred and placed in a spiritual context and equate to spiritual abuse. So, where you have someone who, with their money in some way, controls a lot. That's financial control. That's that sort of, I have the purse strings, so to speak, and Who's paying your salary? Who's paying for this? But I know of cases, Graham, where pastors have gone in with their families. They've not been well provided for. They've been promised certain things, and there's been no fulfillment of that. They have, to some degree, experienced that kind of coercive, emotional abuse. It's part of the ministry. It's part of the calling, and even I think Christian Charities can be guilty of that as well. Where you have staff who, yes, they're called to this work. They want to be a part of this work. They believe in this work, but they also have families to feed and to be with and to take care of. And sometimes expectations can be, well, okay, you need to work overtime for free. Because this is part of the ministry. This is part of serving the Lord. I think that can be a bit spiritually abusive.
It can, and what's interesting, just reeling back a little bit to your domestic abuse point, is that part of the tragedy of spiritual abuse in a church, or abuse of power in a church, is that the victims or the survivors feel particularly conflicted because it was the very place where they were expecting nurture and safety.
Right.
And that is a parallel with abuse in the home. In a sense, if you get, it's not at all good and it's traumatic if you get robbed in the street. But if you get robbed in your own home in some way, that feels worse because it's the very place of safety that you're expecting. And people who have been abused in a church feel so confused because this is where they were nurtured perhaps and expected it to be the safest place, and it wasn't the safest place. I don't want to overstate every little disagreement, but there are people who have been traumatized by their experience in churches. And as I said earlier, you don't have to validate every single experience and say every case is abuse. But the fact is there are people who are traumatized and hurt by what they have been through. And that needs talking through. And yes, so there is, to answer your question a bit more, there is a parallel with that abuse that happens in the home in terms of money and authority and just the practicality. Lots of people stay in abusive relationships domestically because of just the practicality of what do I do if I get out of this. There's an emotional control, but there's also a financial, practical, where do I live kind of control thing that happens. So a sort of pragmatic thing to say, I can't leave because of that. And it's not quite the same in churches because people are freer to leave churches, but that same sense of being a bit trapped can sometimes happen.
So in Challenging Leaders, you talk a little bit about trauma.
Yes.
And you define trauma in the context of spiritual abuse and give pastoral advice on how to care for those who suffer. In many of our churches, we will have people who come to us in that state of trauma from another church. How do we deal with that? Yeah.
There was a great seminar I was at recently at a conference just dealing with that topic, specifically trauma. And obviously people can come traumatized from lots of other experiences, not just spiritual abuse or abuse of power in another church. I think we have to deal with it by listening carefully, recognizing the signs in the first place of trauma in terms of people's spiritual numbness, conflicted feelings of faith, but lack of faith in the church. And I think reintroducing them to Jesus as the Good Shepherd and getting them to focus on Christ and learning to trust Him, and I think gently and slowly reintroducing them to the church. I think that there isn't like a silver bullet in terms of people who've been traumatized, and sometimes what we want to happen is we want them to be better, so we want to fix them. So what we want is for them, we want to say, yes, I can understand now from all that you've said, this experience was wrong. So I own it. I recognise it, and now I want you to be better, because we've recognised it, and you need to get over it. So we need to be patient, I think, as much as anything else, patient in listening, and to bring the healing of the gospel, and only gently over time encourage people to start operating again as it were, normal Christians. So not kind of expect them to just immediately start to operate as normal Christians straight away. You know, you've been here a month, you should join the church, because we're a nice bunch of people, we've heard your story, yes, it's very sad, join our church and everything will be fine. There might be moments later on when you've listened for a long time, when you need to gently encourage someone to say, I think you're ready to commit. I think you should commit to this church. I think there is a degree of self-discipline that you need to exercise in recognizing that, yes, you've been hurt, but yes, Christ loves you, we love you, and you can function. And there is a degree of self-discipline that's needed by the individual in getting back to work. But lots of patience needed, I think, is the big message.
In Matthew 23, we read Jesus speaks to the crowds and his disciples, saying, "The scribes and the Pharisees sit on Moses' seat, so practice and observe what they tell you, but not what they do. For they preach but do not practice. They tie up heavy burdens, hard to bear, and they lay them on people's shoulders, but they themselves are not willing to move them with their finger. They do all their deeds to be seen by others." And then he goes on just to highlight that there's basically throughout that chapter the hypocrisy of the scribes and Pharisees and the abusive behavior that they are a part of, that they are perpetuating. All of that, we've talked a lot about toxic culture. We've talked a lot about spiritually abusive leaders. How can we seek to engender the seed for and establish and grow healthy church culture?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think the burden of the book is to focus people's minds much more on the healthy culture chapters and a bit, information from the other chapters. But actually, if we have a healthy church culture, a lot of those things will never bubble to the surface and become something that needs a process and that needs, dealing with. Often it can be dealt with at a low level. So I think healthy church cultures are cultures where all members are respected, where biblical order is observed in terms of leadership, but that leadership is operated in a biblical way. We don't just say we've got the office, which is biblical. We also want the way that office is fulfilled to be biblical too. And I think healthy church cultures are one where both the office and the operation of the office are biblical. And where we as leaders, I know it sounds very obvious, but it's so important. We point people to Christ and we make people feel more like they're under the leadership of Christ than they are under the leadership of us, which is the case. And if they feel like they're hanging on our every word, we've done something wrong. However good we are at preaching, if they're hanging on our every word, then we've done something wrong. They should be hanging on Christ's every word and feel like, if my leader tomorrow was not here, I'd be desperately sad. Depending on the circumstances, I might be very sad, but I wouldn't be bereft. Right. Because I've still got Christ and I've still got Christ people that I'm in fellowship with. And a healthy church culture is one where a leader is not indispensable. They're not indispensable, but they're not seen as indispensable. Right. I think that's a great thing to aim at.
Where leaders themselves in how they lead, to some degree, are almost working themselves out of jobs, because there are people actively serving, actively seen to be involved in building one another up. Yeah. Of course, if you, it could be that tragedy strikes and a church is suddenly robbed of its pastor in some way. What you would want to see then is the church community band together around the pastor's family and help them in those particular ways, but to not have anyone in that community, in that congregation thinking, oh, well, what will we do as a church now?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, I'm not trying to say gifting's not important.
Sure.
I think pastors are really important under God. And you would miss, I mean, I hope my church, if I drop dead on the way home, hopefully not, because I'll be driving.
Oh, we don't miss Graham.
I hope they don't say that. I hope they're sad and they do gather around my family and everything else. Yeah. But I hope they don't feel like we can't go on. That this leader is so significant to me, and I'm so emotionally, spiritually dependent on him that I can't go on as a Christian anymore. That's what I'm worried about. And I think that healthy church culture also does have processes in place, because processes help us because we're sinners. So there's a culture that's open to critique, open to persuasion and to listening, but also recognizing God's order. But then a process that says, just like in Timothy, where it says, accusations against an elder should be 2 or 3 witnesses, picking up the Old Testament thing, Old Testament principle. And so we have a process that says, this is how we deal with low-level accusations, to call it that, informally. This is how we deal with them as they escalate. This is how we make sure this is an independent process. It's fair to the leader. It's fair to the person who's alleging a problem. It's also taking in wisdom from other people who've gone through similar things. And then it cares for the accused and the accuser afterwards. So you want a process that's part of that culture.
In Matthew 18, we see, and I urge you viewers, if you're having some issue with a brother or sister in Christ, before you make this a big deal and you talk with anyone and everyone about your gripe, if your brother sins against you, words of the Lord here, go and tell him his fault between you and him alone. So other people shouldn't be brought into this. If you have an issue, go to them and tell them alone. If he listens to you, you have gained your brother. But if he does not listen, take 1 or 2 others along with you, that every charge may be established by the evidence of 2 or 3 witnesses. If he refuses to listen to them, tell it to the church. And then it's only after that process that if the individual refuses to listen to the church, that they're then removed from that fellowship. But even in that process, there, I think we see very clearly in 1st and 2nd Corinthians that there's a desire for restoration and reconciliation. Yes. There's a desire to bring back.
Absolutely. And like you, I encourage our viewers to think about the Matthew 18 as an option, well, not as an option, as an actual command, a biblical principle to be followed. But there is also the 1 Timothy accusation against an elder process as well. And sometimes there's a degree of wisdom needed, but good leadership teams can weigh that to say, no, this is something that can be dealt with informally, as it were, in the Matthew 18 process, which is pretty informal until it escalates. And then when you get up to bring it to the church, if it's against a leader rather than another Christian brother, then there are processes outlined in Timothy that we need to follow.
And of course we see that example in Galatians where Paul confronts Peter's public, and I would say spiritually abusive behavior. He's having fellowship with non-Jews, Gentile believers. Suddenly Jewish believers arrive and Peter's like, I'll have nothing to do with them, and starts alienating and ostracizing those Gentile believers in a way. Paul says that he withstood Peter to his face. And so I think there's a level where public sin, in many cases, needs to be dealt with in a public way. Graham, thank you so much. The time has really flown. Thank you for joining us as we've talked on this edition of Bible Topics about spiritual abuse. Any final words in the last seconds?
Just to follow the Good Shepherd, Jesus.
Amen. And please do check out Challenging Leaders. Look at Affinity, which is a gospel network. I'm sure you'll be blessed by what you find there. Bless you, and I pray that God will keep you as you continue to work through this topic in your own mind in prayer. Have a good evening.